Sunday, August 16, 2026. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism on Substack at The Anthony Davis. Our guest today is a lawyer, public defender, and author. Her book on the criminal court system and smarter public safety solutions, called The Price of Mercy, is available in all bookshops, and her new book, entitled Andromeda Diaz and the Reasonable Doubt, is available from the 8th of September. Emily Galvin Almanza, welcome back to the Weekend Show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back.
Before we get into the meat and the corruption, tell me about Andromeda Diaz, because it's a children's book, isn't it?
It is. It's a middle grade book. I have a little advanced copy right here so people can see Andromeda herself. It's an attempt to really teach young readers about the Constitution, how the legal system works, how to be skeptical of accusation, and how to protect their rights. There's a little bit of legal first aid built into it. It's actually the first of a series of kids' mystery novels I'm going to be doing to hope to increase kids' education about this piece of civics that they often miss in school.
Fantastic. I wish you every success with that. Sounds brilliant.
Thank you.
Let's go to the very top of the Justice Department first and talk about Todd Blanche, who, of course, is Donald Trump's former criminal defense attorney. He was confirmed as Deputy Attorney General March last year and became Acting Attorney General on the 2nd of April. Well, just a few days ago, he finally got confirmed, as many of us predicted, that and this was a narrow vote, just a one vote kind of between them, to confirm him as Attorney General on last Saturday morning, cementing Trump's former lawyer as the head of the Justice Department, despite rare pushback from Republicans that had left his nomination in doubt. This is really a very blatant form of corruption coming out of the Justice Department. Normally, presidents have wanted purposely to look like they're keeping their distance and they don't have relationships with the Attorney General. Donald Trump has thrown that rulebook out of the window, and Todd Blanche seems very happy to. In fact, he actually said, "I love Donald Trump," and said it several times recently. I mean, this is an incestuous relationship, isn't it?
You know, ever since that message, do you remember the message Trump typed out to Pam Bondi that sounded like maybe it was a DM that he accidentally tweeted?
Sure.
Ever since that moment, there's just been completely mask off, absolutely no pretense about this administration treating the Department of Justice as if it is their personal legal workshop. Now, let's remember, the White House is not without counsel. There exists the Office of the White House Counsel. That's why the Department of Justice is relieved of any responsibility to represent the White House, the executive branch, or its interests in that particular personalized way that this president is very clearly seeking. What we have instead is a confirmation where, I'll tell you, my heart sank when I saw that Murkowski and Collins were going to vote no. So I was like, man, if they come out saying they're going to vote no, it means the Republicans have the votes elsewhere, because those two never really leave their party in peril. The other thing that was so disheartening and which really cemented the mask off moment for me, obviously the president, makes no compunction about how he feels that the Department of Justice should work personally for him, carry out his personal retributive goals, his personal petty grievances. But when they were interviewing, when NPR was reporting on the Republicans who had chosen to vote yes on Blanche, there were statements floating around that, oh man, we don't like this guy and we don't really think he's going to push back on the president. We don't really think he's that independent, but we're not comparing him to the perfect AG. We're comparing him to whoever this president brings next, who could be worse. That was the most depressing possible statement, because of course, if you are an elected official tasked with one of the most important decisions about who will be running America's Justice Department, and the best you can say is, man, this president brings so many awful people, the next guy could be worse. No, please compare the candidate to the ideal AG that you would actually want. Please do that work, please. And by the way, you can probably tell I am not the biggest fan of the right wing, but I believe that there are hundreds of lawyers who are registered Republicans who could do a decent job running the Justice Department. We don't have to pretend like the only candidates out there are bootlickers.
So let's talk about loyalty and allegiance, because, or bootlicking, as you quite rightly put it, because I've seen several judges come up for hearings where they've been asked a question by a lot of kind of Democratic senators, and that is that who won the 2020 election. This has become a kind of test question, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And Todd Blanche is one of those who simply will not kind of give the facts a hearing. And this seems to have become the stress test of loyalty for Donald Trump. Like, he wants these individuals to deny that Joe Biden legitimately won the election, and it should have been Donald Trump's. And so they use very vague language, don't they? Why do you think that specifically is kind of this test of allegiance? And why is Todd Blanche idolizing Donald Trump in this way?
So I don't know how many Trekkies watch your program, but there's an episode of Star Trek in which Captain Picard, played by Patrick Stewart, is basically being held prisoner. And he's being shown a number of lights, and he's being asked to say a different number. Are there 3 lights or 4 lights or 5 lights? And his resistance to their brainwashing is to continually insist on an accurate count of the number of lights. This is that because, first of all, let's remember that the electoral interference that's being alleged here would have been carried out under the Trump administration. Joe Biden was running for president while Donald Trump was president. So let's start there. Second of all, we have this sort of like electoral landslide. People often talk in the field about an election that's too big to cheat on, or too big to rig. Too big to rig. Thank you. I don't know why my mind just went blank there. I was still thinking about Star Trek. But this is too big to rig. It's a great example of too big to rig, right? Yeah. Enormous turnout, enormous margin of victory. So when you ask a candidate, are you going to say something that adheres to our historical record as a nation and the facts as they are most logically interpreted? Or are you going to say a story that we know is personally very important to the ego of the president? And I say personally because the Republican Party doesn't need that narrative to advance their agenda. That is not it's not a load-bearing piece of the Republican narrative. It's a piece that's extremely personally important to the president. And so this is a litmus test of how much does your loyalty lie with this one individual versus the rest of us who would like to live in a shared reality. So it's a really depressing litmus test. It played out in a depressing way. I will also say there's a lot of, as a lawyer, there's some real complexity here. Now, there are ways for someone's former personal attorney to shift roles and take on appropriately a different ethical relationship to that person. But I will say, as a criminal defense attorney myself, I have an ongoing duty of loyalty to my clients, which means that just because they're not my client anymore doesn't mean I can betray their confidences or work against their interests in a subsequent matter. One has to be very careful about how one parses out where a conflict lies, where there may be ethical cross purposes. I don't personally see that work being done here. Like, it's a complex legal ethical question I have not really heard addressed. So there's both the litmus test of how many lights there are in the 2020 election, and also this concerning abdication of the duty to analyze what is the ongoing loyalty here.
Many of us were saying that when Pam Bondi was supposedly running the department, that really it was Todd Blanche doing much of the donkey work, and Donald Trump couldn't get Pam Bondi to be as corrupt as he might like, but he knew that Todd Blanche was up for the challenge, and so with Todd Blanche came a whole bunch of new lawsuits and announcements that would scare anybody that was still kind of clinging on to any form of democracy. Let's not forget that they gutted the department. I mean, around 16,000 DOJ employees have left the department, including a quarter of its attorneys, and Blanche has overseen the termination of hundreds of employees, including agents and professional staff who worked on the January 6 cases and the Jack Smith investigations as well. I mean, it really has been hollowed out so that it is Donald Trump's personal office. Blanche, when going through hearings recently, kind of gives the impression that he doesn't care about any of the criticism, that he really is not fussed about what people think of him, that his loyalty matters more than anything. To me, Emily, that suggests that both Todd Blanche and maybe Pam Bondi before him, and certainly Donald Trump and all of the villains in this orbit, don't think that they are ever going to get caught for the crimes that they are committing whilst in office. That Donald Trump thinks that he will be the last president of the United States, and that no due process will follow these people once they eventually pass the baton to somebody else.
Yeah, let me talk about this in two parts. So thing one, you see a lot of people leaving DOJ, more than you see people, for example, leaving ICE or DHS. I think this is in part because, and this is totally just me guessing, one lawyer looking at other lawyers, that lawyers are extremely aware that if you follow an illegal instruction, if you contravene your ethical duties, your duty of candor to the court, or your duty to, pursue legitimate prosecutions rather than retributive or personal vendettas, that's on you. There's no, the Nuremberg defense was not a defense. You cannot say I was just following orders, and lawyers are highly aware of this. I was thinking actually today about, what we do with the legions of street level law enforcement. I was reading, and I know we're probably going to talk about ICE in a little while, but I was reading about the shot gloves they're paying to get. And I was thinking, what accountability will we find in the future for illegal acts carried out by street level operatives in this administration? And one thing I think you'll notice is that the remaining people at DOJ who made the call that they are not concerned about their ability to follow the instructions they are given in their current role, and also people on the street level who are apparently not concerned about their instructions and their ability to follow them legally, ethically, morally, is that they are all arising from a culture of impunity that we made ourselves. It started long before Trump. Here's what I mean. There was a study of prosecutors in California. It looked at about 800 prosecutors, all of whom were found to have engaged in misconduct, right? So we're not looking at a mixed bag of some people were fine, some people were getting dirty. It was 800 people who'd done something wrong. And of those 800 prosecutors who we know had done something wrong, 0.01% were ever disciplined. So when we look at something like that, where prosecutors at the state and local level are able to essentially operate without fear of any kind of accountability if they break the rules. They can break the rules. No one's going to come down on them. They're not going to lose their license. They're certainly not going to risk prosecution themselves. Or, as a criminal defense attorney, you can ask any one of us anywhere in the country, throw a dart, ask a public defender. They will tell you that law enforcement lying on the witness stand is so common, we have a term for it. We call it test-a-lying. And when you talk to researchers in the field, it's so common that nobody's really able to even quantify how often it's happening, other than it's happening every day. And a lot of the times this is very minor stuff because our system asks police officers ridiculous things, as in, Mr. Police Officer, can you tell me exactly what happened on that one day 3 years ago when you were the arresting officer on this case? And they have to say, yes, I remember perfectly that one day 3 years ago. So a lot of it is just common everyday lying, but none of them are afraid of a perjury prosecution, right? So it's a culture of impunity that begins in our county criminal courts. And that often is where these people rise from. Pam Bondi doesn't come out of nowhere. She comes out of a culture of impunity where no one on the law enforcement side, prosecutor, police, investigator, or judge, has anything to worry about when they blatantly break the rules. So I personally think we are seeing this in a very painfully obvious, spotlit way in the current administration. But if we want to fix this long term, we can't just put a Band-Aid on bad actors at DOJ. We actually have to start thinking about how we hold people accountable for righteous honesty and moral rectitude in the lowest lowest reaches of our courts.
And Merrick Garland, in the role under Joe Biden, kind of went the other way with this, didn't he? I mean, he did not go far enough. He tried to give the impression that he was as hands-off from the executive as possible, to the extent that he allowed a villain, a criminal, a fraudster in Donald Trump, and consequently his criminal defense attorney, Todd Blanche, to rise to the ranks of president and attorney general, knowing full well that these people were criminals. I mean, that is going to go down in history, isn't it, as a dereliction of duty?
And you know what pains me is it's really hurt people's faith in the courts. You know, you hear people all the time say, like, the courts can't do anything about this. Well, in fact, when we look at our courts, the ACLU wins against this administration 70% of the time in court. When we look at the broader, district and appellate federal courts, this administration loses roughly 75% of the time. And sure, some of those cases get appealed to the Supreme Court, and we can have a whole separate conversation about what's happening up there. But this is court capture. But in general, the reason most people don't realize that our courts are actually one of the last bastions of democratic due process in this country, and our courts are operating really well, is because the media, when it reports on what's happening, it'll say, Trump does a thing. They should say Trump attempts to do a thing. He is attempting. Someone's going to have a say about that, but they'll say Trump ends birthright citizenship. Nope, he attempted to. And then there will be some litigation, and the media will report the initial injunction in the case, which is basically a judge saying, we're either going to hit pause while I decide this, or we're not going to hit pause while I decide this. And they report the injunction as if it's the whole decision. For example, Trump tries to shut down a wind farm, and the court's like, we can shut down the wind farm while I decide this. And the media's like, Trump shut down the wind farm. Well, 6 months later, he loses the case and the wind farm is back up and running, but no one by that point in our insane cycle remembers that. So, you know, when you look at someone like Merrick Garland, who I think was trying to handle things with extreme care and deeply, rigorous moral, ethical processes and separation from the executive branch, and he just moved real slow. He moved at like the speed of smell.
Right.
That destroyed people's faith in the courts in a way that the media continues to do, when in fact the courts are holding, and the courts, I say this as someone who just wrote an entire book on problems in the courts. I am a critic of our courts. And even I will say that right now our courts are amazing, especially our federal bench.
I noticed this week that a U.S. federal judge has dismissed Trump's lawsuit that claimed that Harvard failed to protect Jewish and Israeli students from harassment in the aftermath of the war in Gaza. It was on Thursday morning in Boston. The judge said that the administration's lawsuit that was filed in March failed to plausibly show an ongoing violation of federal civil rights law on Harvard's campus. I mean, that was a story that was huge at the time. And as you say, now we'll just kind of go by with mainly a whimper.
Yeah, this is exactly the problem. It's the American attention span met with really inaccurate reporting. The media could say up front, our president has attempted to do something, and the judge is making an initial decision about whether something can continue while the case goes on. I rarely see that level of care exerted. There's more, I think sometimes a lot of the reporters who cover this stuff cover it all the time. So they're very familiar with the process. They're very conversant in the language of the courts. And they forget that the vast majority of people do not speak legalese. And so for the vast majority of readers, it's really, really beneficial to break it down, explain it to me like I'm 5. That's actually a good thing, and we need more of that from our legal reporting.
So just from your perspective then, because it is depressing and people are suffering a collective anxiety of Trumpism, this kind of pox of the loss of democracy, and it hurts, and people are carrying a lot of stress and a lot of weight in their hearts. Would you say from your perspective, with the benefit of legalese, that actually Donald Trump is failing and the court system is holding?
Yes.
Because, with this change of attorney general, that suggests that they will weaponize the department more often than not. But you believe there are still judges that are holding out for the rule of law.
I will tell you, not only do I believe it, I am not alone in believing it. I had a conversation with a federal judge recently who voiced not only their very encouraging perspective that these judges are brave. And when I say they will hold, I don't mean like they're going to toe the Democrat Party line. What I mean is they will decide cases fairly and with the best evidence in front of them. And this judge had also praised their colleagues who were Trump appointees, because there is something, not all of them, not going to name names. They're not all giving the cases in front of them the most legitimate of shakes. However, some of them are. Some of them have adapted to the culture of the federal bench. And they have said that I am a judge first. I am a jurist first. And whatever political views I hold comes second to my judicial perspective, which is, of course, the only way to be a legitimate judge. So I have a great deal of faith. I've been really encouraged by the bravery of our federal judges. I mean, you have to understand, they don't feel safe. People send pizzas to their houses. Judges have experienced assaults and even homicides within their families. These are people who are choosing to do the right thing when doing the right thing is very, very, very hard. So I think they don't get enough credit. And part of the reason they don't get enough credit is that our Supreme Court is so embarrassing that it sucks a lot of the air out of the conversation about the bench generally.
The Justice Department on Wednesday arrested a leading expert on far-right extremism, charging her with financial crimes as part of the government's ongoing case against the Southern Poverty Law Center. Federal prosecutors charged Heidi Beerich, who formerly worked as an executive overseeing work monitoring hate groups, with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to submit false statements to a federally insured bank, and conspiracy to commit concealment money laundering. Her claim is that these are politically motivated charges. This does seem to be one of the routes that the judiciary takes to kind of, or that the administration takes to kind of take people out who, and I mean, he did it with Letitia James, or he tried to do it with Letitia James, over rental payments and other things. They look for something else other than what it is that they do, and use that as a reason to remove them from their jobs and from society. I mean, this is a very kind of underhand way of approaching the law, isn't it? But do you think this is going to be the way that Todd Blanche will run the department?
I mean, I have a dim view of the way prosecutorial discretion is often exercised in this country. Our system has evolved to vest prosecutors with enormous power, not just in the fact that they hold untouchable power over the decision of whom to charge and what to charge them with, but also because of mandatory minimums and sentencing guidelines. They get to pick what the exposure is for a person. And when I say exposure, I mean how many years of prison or how much in fines, or what kind of penalty is this person facing. We are not a country generally where a prosecutor can pick the charges and then a judge can temper the punishment. Prosecutors have a lot of power over the exposure and therefore over their own leverage against a person, because of course exposure is the kind of fear-inducing factor that gives the prosecution a great deal of leverage. That is the reason why in our system 95% of people or more plead guilty. It's not because everybody's actually guilty. It's because most people, when faced with a very scary potential outcome, choose not to roll the dice and will choose some sort of lesser, safer, but guilt-involving outcome. So I want to first criticize the fact that we've built a country in which we handed a small group of lawyers, prosecutors, such overweening power. And at the same time, in doing so, have failed to recognize that we are a country where we process all of our social war issues through the criminal courts, which is why you have, women being prosecuted for murder over abortions. Or protesters being arrested on made up terrorism charges and conflating speech with action in ways that are completely violative of the First Amendment. But the point is, you're right. Prosecutors can really derail a person because that person may ultimately prevail. We saw James Comey prevail. We saw Tish James prevail. We've seen a lot. We saw the guy accused of ripping up the smarmy pond prevail. We saw the sandwich thrower prevail. Like, people prevail because we have beautiful due process in this country, a thing this administration really hates. We have a right to a jury of our peers, and people on the jury have the right to reject permutations of justice they find offensively unfair. But the process to get there absolutely sucks. If a person is accused, they have to get counsel. Many people don't qualify for public defense, which means that they have to find the ability to afford a lawyer. There's a vast chasm of middle-class people who can neither really afford counsel nor qualify for public defense. They get extra harmed in our system that is going to abuse them financially, cause them to possibly lose their job, at least have to go on sabbatical, give them incredible quantities of stress and fear, like life-shortening stress and fear for a period of months. So I guess it's a hard thing to hold the duality of, which is both. We need to be grateful and fight like hell to protect the beautiful due process we have in this country that has resulted in good outcomes in a lot of these nakedly political prosecutions. And yet we also have to recognize that we've given prosecutors too much power to ruin lives entirely by themselves, and a long waiting period before somebody else can step in and stop them.
Let's use one final person as an example in this conversation, and that's the former Olympic canoeist David Hearn. This very sweet man cycling by DC hears on the media all the stories about the botched reflecting pool, stops on his bike, sticks his hand in the water, touches some of this lining that's flapping around in the water, and gets arrested, handcuffed, and the rest is one of the most tragic stories of judicial overreach. This is Janine Pirro, of course, at the center of this. What did you feel when you saw that? I mean, the case has been dropped now. We should give people the ending first, just so they know. But, and he now has every right to sue the Trump administration. I'm sure he's looking at all of his options. And he has some very good counsel as well, well-known lawyers who've stepped up to help him. But, I mean, when I saw him interviewed, he really did look like a broken man. This guy was literally a passerby. And Donald Trump still, just in the last 48 hours, still wants him prosecuted for vandalism.
I was at the reflecting pool just a few weeks before he was. It was when they were still bleaching it.
Right.
And I was there because, I had an event to go to in DC. I wanted to take my kid to see the Lincoln Memorial. Whenever I'm in DC, I have to go to the Lincoln Memorial and weep, read both walls and weep and get choked up and be the really lame mom who's explaining how beautiful President Lincoln was. And it was my poor kid has to sit through my lectures about the Civil War. And anyway, I remember I was standing at the Lincoln Memorial and I was looking out over the reflecting pool, which was not at that time doing a great job of reflecting anything because it was super green. And my daughter said, let's go down there. Let's look at it. Because kids love to look at water, right? I would never have touched it because the water is from the Potomac. Why? But I remember I was standing there on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and I said, no, because I am a public defender. And what immediately came to my mind was, if I walk near that thing, I don't want anyone to perceive my presence as interference of any kind. I don't want to go anywhere near a thing that this administration's eyes are on. I don't want to be wrongly accused. Literally all of the threat of prosecutorial overreach was so immediately in my gut that I would not even walk down the path next to the reflecting pool. I went all the way over to the Vietnam War Memorial, and then my poor kid had to also hear why that is such a brilliant memorial. But setting that aside, what was done to that man and what is done to so many other people who suffer through government overreach, wrongful prosecution, political prosecution, retributive prosecution, because it is endemic to this government, but it is also endemic in America. I mean, I've worked in towns where I knew prosecutors didn't like a particular person. And I knew that that person was at very high risk for scrutiny and arrest in their daily lives because the local cops and prosecutors just didn't like them. We don't have a system for holding prosecutors accountable when they do that. We have a lot of absolute immunity for prosecutors in this country. You often hear about qualified immunity for police officers, basically meaning that ordinary people cannot personally sue police officers for things they do in the line of duty. Interestingly, if listeners are so inclined, there's an organization called Protect Ethical Prosecutors, which is an organization dedicated to protecting the good work that's being done in that field and also increasing accountability to roust out bad work like retributive prosecutions, malicious prosecutions. Protect Ethical Prosecutors is currently bringing an initiative. My understanding is they're working on the question of, could we end prosecutorial immunity, this absolute immunity that shields prosecutors from civil suit accountability? Could we end it in Colorado? It's an interesting question because, one, Colorado already ended qualified immunity for police officers. The sky has not fallen. Not every cop in the world has been sued for misconduct. Like, suits have been reasonable and limited, and like Colorado's doing just fine. So it's proof that you can end qualified immunity and everything can be fine. And also this polls really well. And like Coloradoans seem to be kind of on board with the idea that no one should be above the law. And so to me, this entire event, yes, it shines a spotlight on the retributive nature of this administration and the incredible power prosecutors hold to do harm without anybody being able to stop them, at least for the first chunk of a case. But also, it raises for me in the future, when these people are no longer in power, would it be a good idea to restrict the power of prosecutors to be free from any form of liability or accountability for their decisions?
That image of you choosing to stay away from the reflecting pool might suggest to some that we really are living in a fascist state, and that the dictatorship is complete. Because even you, with your experience and your what goes with that you could represent yourself if you needed to, and yet you still choose to not get in the way, because what that suggests to me is that it's going to stop people from going to protests and demonstrations or getting in the way of ICE vehicles, because there is this collective fear that just being in the wrong place at the wrong time could end your life, both physically and metaphorically.
I have to say yes and no, because there's fear and then there's literacy. I have a very high degree of literacy in criminal court systems because that's where I live. And so, yeah, I have a really good spidey sense for dangerous zones that might attract inappropriate law enforcement attention. I do not consider protests to be such a zone. I still consider it safe to protest in this country, as millions of people have proven in recent months, last year. Millions of people. I think it is more dangerous to protest ICE because they have shown themselves to be untrained, unrestrained. I know police officers who have drawn their gun once in 30 years. And yet these guys out there with 4 weeks of training and no trigger discipline and the emotional restraint of a tambourine are a lethal danger to people exercising their First Amendment rights. So different contexts create different levels of danger. But when I say literacy, I also mean we are increasingly living in a world of mass surveillance. There are researchers in my field who are out there saying, don't worry, it's great that we could all be surveilled all the time because all that data is in the hands of law enforcement, so we're going to be fine. Which is, by the way, a shocking thing to say in this moment in history. But increasingly, it is very hard. I really admire the communities that have resisted mass surveillance dragnets. But even as those communities resist, others are installing the kind of camera network that not only tracks people's license plates and, does facial recognition or listens into people's voices as they speak on the street corner, but the kind of network that hasn't yet really been demonstrated to like stop murders and has been shown to allow creepy cops to stalk their ex-girlfriends. So I think that a certain level of literacy in how to safely go out onto the street when mass surveillance is growing in our culture, how to become aware of what your town is doing, looking into what systems your county board of supervisors is purchasing, paying for, and installing in your neighborhoods. Thinking about what of your data is out there to be sold and repackaged and delivered to who knows who. Like, these are things we all, unfortunately, have to be much more conversant in right now as a society.
We have to take a quick break, but after the break, we'll talk a little more about this, because the Trump regime has spent tens of millions of dollars building out the ability of immigration enforcement agents to collect DNA samples from detainees. You mentioned the electric shock gloves. We'll look at that as well in just a moment here on The Weekend Show. A brief word on something practical. I'll say this as someone who didn't grow up with the American healthcare system. Medicare is bewildering. Hundreds of plans, shifting rules, and a torrent of marketing, and somehow every option manages to look both official and suspicious at once. Here's the piece most people never hear. Many Medicare agents are paid more to place you in certain plans, which rather explains the quality of the advice on offer. Which brings me to our partner, Chapter. Chapter is the only Medicare advisor that compares every plan nationwide. And they are honest, not paid to steer you toward any particular plan. They'll walk you through your options in plain English. And if you're already on the right plan, they'll simply tell you so. The service is free, takes under 20 minutes, and has saved people an average of $1,100 a year. If you're on Medicare, or soon will be, make it easy on yourself. Call Chapter at 334-441-3570. We're back on The Weekend Show with Emily Galvin Almanza. I'm Anthony Davis. Emily, just before the break, we were talking about judicial overreach, and it seems that that's not going to stop with the Immigration and Customs Enforcement's plan to give officers gloves that deliver painful electric shocks. This was announced earlier this week on Wednesday, I think, and civil rights advocates and elected Democrats called it unnecessary and cruel. Is it the case under this Trump administration that cruelty is the point? Absolutely.
I think what people often forget is that immigration enforcement is a bureaucratic process. It is an administrative form of enforcement. It is about whether people have the right papers to be where they are. Now, when we talk about policing, police in this country are armed and entitled to do violence against community members under some circumstances because they are the people you call if there's a bad guy with a gun. We understand, even though I will tell you candidly, the vast majority of police responses are for like dogs barking and people bothering their neighbors. We still understand that their context involves the risk of violence. Now, the context of immigration enforcement is not generally, as our administration would have you believe, like chasing down foreign gang members. That's actually a policing function. The role of our immigration enforcement is largely to deal with people whose visas have expired or whose asylum status has been revoked for some reason, or who were supposed to report to court and didn't. But what they don't tell you is that our country's immigration courts are backed up to the point of being functionally dysfunctional. What I mean by that is, let's imagine you came here, you have a working permit, you have a visa, you've lived here for 25 years, you have a job, you realize that your work permit is up for renewal, and you send it in a timely fashion to get it renewed. You show up to your hearing, you fill out all the right papers, and you're just waiting for the courts to renew your papers. Our courts are so slow that people will often be functionally rendered out of status because the court took too long to process their paperwork. So it's not their fault in any way, shape, or form. It's just a court delay. Technically, they're out of status. Past administrations would say, well, yeah, but we know it's just for a court delay, so we're not going to deport hardworking, legitimately here people over this. In this administration, bam, this is a window in which to nab you, to take you away sobbing, to use our shock gloves on you, to possibly kill you in the street or put you in a fetid detention center where you die for lack of insulin. So obviously the cruelty is the point, because we are using performatively violent means in a context where violence has never been legitimized or called for. Again, this is administrative bureaucratic enforcement. And so it's gotten to the point of performative goonery, where this administration now has the power of a force whose reputation is so frightening that for many people, citizens, if they were outside your house, you'd be afraid to go outside, even if, like me, you're born in Iowa City, Iowa. So yes, it's a very powerful thing. Just by mentioning, oh, maybe we could deploy ICE to check for, illegal voting. Yeah, there's a federal law against federal agents coming in within a certain distance of polling places. But this is an administration that has routinely broken laws, norms, and now has an intimidation force whose cruelty is enhancedly notable in order to intimidate the public.
A third person died this week at Delaney Hall, the immigration detention center in New Jersey. The thing that doesn't seem to get enough coverage, and I think it's partly because people don't really understand what asylum is, certainly in international law. Donald Trump, of course, thinks it's something to do with mental asylums, and we know that is a clear point of confusion for him. But certainly from what I've heard from Tom Homan and, any of the henchmen that kind of deal with this stuff, is that asylum is basically illegal in America now. Yeah. And that your right to claim asylum in the next safe country is null and void in America. Yeah, I mean,
all along the way, the messaging from this administration has criminalized normal stuff. So, for example, it is legal to come across the border and ask for asylum. That's literally what asylum is going into the next country and saying, I cannot go back to my home for fear of persecution, death, dismemberment, horrifying outcomes. May I have safety here?
Right. And that can include political unrest, of course.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Persecution for LGBTQ people in countries where that's not acceptable and potentially lethal as a sexual orientation. I mean, so we, as a beacon of light in the world, can and have been in the past a place where people could gain safety from persecution. But this administration is constantly saying things like they crossed the border illegally. They came to petition for asylum. The petition for asylum renders the crossing acceptable within the legal process under asylum doctrine. So the messaging to the public just, again, with people who are being kicked out because their visas were, it's a visa overstay. No, it's a person who asked for renewal and you didn't give it to them in time. The messaging isn't just inaccurate. It's deliberately extremely misleading to huge swaths of the public who don't know enough about immigration law, which is a really complicated morass, in order to be able to call out the bunk that they're hearing. And it's this way of just fomenting fear against our neighbors, the people we are colleagues, the people we go to school with and run into at the grocery store. I blame this administration so deeply, not just for their misconduct on this issue, but for what they have done to people's ability to hold a community, right? To be in community together. I read recently of a couple who was deported. They had claimed in their asylum petition that they would be killed in their hometown, and they were. They were sent back there and killed. So These claims are not bogus. It's not like, somebody fake calling in sick to work. There are millions of people in the world who are in danger because their town has been overtaken by gang violence, or because their government thinks they have no right to live, or that their child is an abomination, or, it is heartbreaking to me. And I think we should all be deeply ashamed that we are no longer people who offer solace. We are people who offer violent persecution in return.
But that also suggests that there will be Americans who want to cross into Canada and claim asylum there from the United States. And yet the system has not caught up with that yet. And even though the ethnic cleansing that you described that's going on in the US could be considered something bad enough to want to claim asylum in Mexico or Canada, there's no drop-down menu or paperwork that has caught up with this dictatorship.
Yeah, and I'm not sure our neighboring nations would look warmly on our cause. Like Americans, I think, have this tendency to assume that we are important to the rest of the world in ways that we aren't actually.
I noticed the new Donald Trump branded US passport includes a phrase of something like "be safe, be good" or something, And Trump didn't quite realize that the passport is used to leave America, not to stay in America. The whole mindset is wrong. It's as if he wants these passports are for people to kind of prove their citizenship rather than to travel the world.
I mean, right now they are. Like I'm sure you and I and everyone else know a lot of people who are keeping their passport on them because it is the most convenient proof of citizenship that we have. Not everyone wants to keep their birth certificate or their naturalization papers on them. So unfortunately, in our current culture, in which, because of our really deeply depressing and unconscionable affordability crisis, where wages aren't keeping up with inflation and more people are out of work, fewer and fewer people have the means to travel the world, which does two things. One, it does render our passport into a domestic document to stave off the violence of our own government. But two, it deprives us of our ability to see firsthand how we're perceived in the world and also how other people live. It cracks me up when politicians start to try to use socialism as a boogeyman or pretend that Maoist China is socialism.
Right.
I mean, this from a president who really admires President Xi and has some weird feelings about Putin. But when young people talk about their socialist ideals, they're usually talking about Nordic countries.
Yes.
And public health care in France.
Yeah.
So, and I think that part of the reason those young people have that vision is because they were able to visit. They're able to go take a school trip, go see Europe, go see a country in which anybody can go to the doctor anytime for any reason and it's free. Or maybe it's going to cost $30 and they're going to apologize to you profusely about how expensive it is. Go to a country where all the universities are free. Everybody gets a free public education if that's the path they choose. When we deprive people of their ability to move about the world, we deprive them of seeing that we don't have it the best here, that American exceptionalism is not factual. And we also deprive them of an understanding of how they're perceived. I remember my amazing mother-in-law, who pulls no punches and talks to anyone about anything. She's so cool. Was speaking to a group of young conservative men recently at a gathering we were at. And they had recently come back from a trip to Europe and they had been shocked by how they were received.
Right.
Because they thought our international reputation was stellar, and it's not. And it had really caused them to rethink their support of this administration when they realized that we are no longer welcome visitors in much of the world. So yeah, that change in whether people can afford to use their passport for what it's actually for, it has a lot of knock-on effects that are terrible for us as a society.
Let's, I suppose, using gloves that have an electric charge in them is not a great advertisement for America. And you have travelers.
It's accurate.
Right. But you have travelers who fear coming to the US.
They should.
Because they don't want to get caught up in this stuff. And they don't want to have their phones seized at the airport. And they don't want to be deported before they even cross the border. I mean, this is very problematic, not least for tourism. And I'm sure that, we haven't even heard the worst of the numbers because they're probably being silenced. But the reality is that the airports are not that busy at the moment, certainly the international ones. The gloves, I just want to go back to them. The device is known as the glove, which actually stands for Generated Low Output Voltage Emitter. They're normal patrol gloves until an officer presses a button to activate the electrical mode, and they have to be applied directly to someone's skin to produce a voltage that causes pain, which is intended to gain compliance from people who are resisting. And unlike tasers, they don't leave burn or contact marks. I mean, the fact that this is even being considered suggests to me that the level of cruelty is as bad as in many of those nations that we were describing earlier as places that people were seeking to escape from. And the problem is that these things happen over time, a kind of drip effect of policy change. And so, if all these things were announced on the same day, people would be like, what the hell has happened to America? I mean, 70% of those detained in ICE detention centers right now have no former criminal record, or any criminal record, in fact. They're just...
And keep in mind that a criminal record can be like speeding in a state where that's a misdemeanor, or possession of marijuana, or being in the park after dark, or having an open container. Like, the specter of a criminal record does not mean that everyone's an arsonist.
And the original point was to go after the worst of the worst, I seem to remember. And they ran out of the worst after a couple of weeks, and then they had to go after the rest of the best. I mean, this is a real problem, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's an incredible national shame. And I think we're going to look back on this period in history the way we look back on Japanese internment and slavery and many other things that this country in its short 250-year lifespan has done really, really wrong.
What is likely, because I was talking to someone about this earlier, and I was saying the likelihood is, and I know Letitia James kind of came out and said that she was appalled at this news. What is the likelihood that the judiciary will kind of get in there and a legal case will be mounted, and that these gloves, which are not going to be used, I don't think they're coming out for a couple of months, that they never actually make it to the front line because the legal system kind of gets in the way, and the people come to their senses? I mean, can we rely on the justice system to deal with things as insane and as offensive as this?
Unfortunately, it is really, really stupidly hard for ordinary people to hold the government accountable in this particular context. For one thing, we've seen multiple instances of the government refusing to even reveal the names of officers involved in instances of violence and potentially misconduct. So you start with that. Start with the fact that they're going to hide people, but also consider the fact that most impacted individuals are whisked away, confined in detention centers where, unlike in a prison or a jail in this country, they are being deprived of access to counsel. I mean, again, I need to point out, if you are accused of a vicious murder in this country, your lawyer can come and talk with you and make arguments on your behalf. If you are whisked away by ICE for being a visa overstay, you will likely not have access to a lawyer, even if you can afford to hire one. So let's start with that. I do think it's really important that local prosecutors try to step in on behalf of people who have been harmed, particularly because even though were they to file a case against these officers, the federal government would immediately try to remove that case to federal court, where they would be able to sort of do whatever they think they can do with it in federal court. Local prosecutors would get to have a hearing about whether it's appropriate to remove that case to federal court. And in that hearing, in that what we call discovery process, they would be entitled to demand all sorts of information from ICE about what ICE was doing in the community, what was the scope of their duty, what was their plan that day, all of which being, relevant evidence to the question of, was this act of violence within the scope of their duties? So purely for discovery alone, I think there's a really good reason for local prosecutors to be trying to take action on these cases. But I also need to point out that we live in a country where the law is not the law as it is written. It's a system of precedent, meaning that there is a law written on paper, the statute, but what the law actually is, where the rubber meets the road, is dependent on judicial interpretation. So how has one judge interpreted it, and then the next judge interpreted that interpretation, and so on and so forth. Judicial opinion, especially in recent decades, has diluted our rights, carving out more and more like exceptions to your Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure, exceptions to your Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination. Rules like, oh, it's not enough to remain silent if you want to invoke your right to remain silent. You have to speak and say you want to remain silent if you want your right to remain silent. I mean, stuff like that. It's especially bad on our Eighth Amendment, which protects us against cruel and unusual punishment. A whole slew of decisions that are sort of like, well, this is cruel, but it's not unusual, so I guess go for it. And the problem is, when the population accepts rulings like that, because we think, oh, they pertain to criminals. It's fine to do that to the bad guys. What we don't realize is we are costing ourselves protection. We are eroding our individual liberties. And so now we live in a world where the protections that we would crave in this context of government overreach have been so weakened by judicial interpretation that we have less to work with than we wish we had. I mean, I don't mean to plug my own book, but I literally just wrote a book on how a lot of this stuff begins in our criminal courts and has ripple effects, which we now see impacting the way the federal government is allowed to engage the citizenry.
The killer of Renee Good, a police officer who was identified, got away with that. He called her an effing bitch after the incident, didn't get prosecuted. I mean, I don't think anything happened to that guy. He's still out there doing his job. I mean, and that's with an American citizen. I mean, that is an example of how protected these people are. I mean, we know historically that police officers who get misconduct charges and lose their jobs just move to another district and join another police force.
We see that all the time. And again, this is something that I've recently written about, like that arises from the fact that 98% of police union contracts have some kind of provision in them that lessens the ability of leadership to get rid of bad actors and protects people from career consequences, long-term career consequences when they engage in violence. Yes, they can move one county over and get rehired to do the same thing to a different population of civilians. But I think the other thing we're seeing here is, all of us during this period in history are sitting with the idea that we had too many norms and not enough enforceable rules. They say a rule without a remedy doesn't really exist, right? Like if there's a rule, but there's no consequence for breaking it, is it really a rule at all? And what we had previously was a lot of trust in our leaders to behave, to comport themselves in a sort of honorable fashion. So what happens when someone's willing to blow up all the norms and accept the reputational hit that seemingly never really comes to a Teflon president? What happens is that we realize we need more enforceable rules. For example, it shouldn't be up to the government's good grace to participate in a state criminal investigation involving federal government employees. They should have to, for example, tell you who the ICE officer was. Like there should not be a situation where people can just hide the ball about life or death matters. And I think that's really a huge takeaway as we think about what it would be to rebuild following this period in history and what it would be to restore our country with a more resilient form of protection of democracy. I think one such thing would have to be, one, creating accountability for powerful actors starting at the most basic levels of the court system, and two, creating actual rules of cooperation, disclosure, and transparency so that there's no more world in which the public is left powerless against a government which can refuse to reveal its own misconduct.
We have to finish, but I'm always grateful for your expertise and your views. But for now, Emily Galvin Almanza, thank you for joining The Weekend Show. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism on Substack at The Anthony Davis. I'll come back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.